Here is something most people accept without hesitation. The great cities of the 19th century were built to serve growing populations. Governments expanded infrastructure, water systems, public buildings, rail networks, in response to rising demand. Population grew, demand followed, supply responded. That is the standard sequence. That is the logic that organizes almost every textbook account of urban development in the modern era. But when you look at the actual construction dates, not the narrative, the dates, something in that sequence begins to feel slightly off. Not wrong. Not reversed. Just off. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. Consider a single example. The city of Chicago, which in 1840 had a recorded population of just over 4,000 people, began constructing a municipal waterworks system in 1842. That system, when completed, had a design capacity that engineers of the period noted was adequate for a city of 100,000. The population at the time of construction did not reach even a tenth of that figure. Standard explanations point to forward planning. Civic engineers, they argue, built ahead of expected growth. That explanation is reasonable. It is also the explanation you will hear for almost every comparable case. And that is where the discomfort begins. Not in any single example, but in how consistently that explanation is required. In 1844, the city of Cincinnati completed an expansion of its public infrastructure that included covered sewer channels running beneath street grids that had not yet been fully laid. Streets that did not exist yet had underground systems beneath them. The common interpretation is again one of optimistic planning, visionary engineers preparing for a future they anticipated. But anticipation, as a historical explanation, tends to work best when it is selective. Engineers in other periods, in other contexts, frequently failed to anticipate growth. The late industrial towns of northern England, for example, were routinely overwhelmed by sanitation crises that their infrastructure simply could not absorb. Cities built around cotton mills, mining operations, and rail junctions were expanding under demand pressure and still could not keep pace. The infrastructure lagged. The disease rates climbed. The historical record on this is extensive and well documented. So the question that begins to form, slowly, without urgency, simply by looking at the timelines side by side, is this. Why in certain places did the infrastructure arrive so far ahead of the demand that it required? And why, in those same places, was the scale of that infrastructure so precisely calibrated to populations that had not yet formed? The answer offered is planning. The follow-up question rarely asked is, planning based on what? Demographic projections in the mid-19th century were not sophisticated instruments. Migration patterns were unpredictable. Industrial growth was volatile. War, disease, and economic disruption could halt a city's expansion for decades. And yet, in a notable cluster of North American and European cities, civic systems were built not merely optimistically, but at scales that presupposed outcomes that had not yet been confirmed, and in some cases, outcomes that took another 50 or 60 years to fully materialize. St. Louis, Missouri is instructive here. In 1850, it was one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. That much is well recorded. But the public buildings constructed in St. Louis during the 1840s and early 1850s included assembly halls, institutional chambers, and administrative structures whose interior square footage far exceeded what any municipal function of the time required. One frequently cited building, the old courthouse, completed in stages through the 1840s, featured a dome construction and interior volume that contemporary critics noted seemed designed for a metropolis rather than a frontier commercial hub. Defenders of the architecture point to civic ambition. The building was meant to project permanence, confidence, a sense of institutional weight. That interpretation is entirely plausible. It also does not explain the plumbing. Because the old courthouse, like several comparable structures in cities of similar size and development stage, was fitted with water infrastructure during its construction, pipe routing, cistern provisions, drainage channels, at a point when municipal water supply to that district was not yet operational. The infrastructure inside the building was ready for a system that did not yet exist outside it. Again, individually, Each of these observations can be absorbed into familiar historical explanations. Engineers plan ahead. Civic leaders overestimate. Ambition outruns need. These are legitimate and often accurate accounts of how cities develop. The question is whether they remain equally satisfying when the pattern repeats. Not once or twice, not in a single country or a single decade, but across multiple cities on multiple continents, over a span of approximately 40 years, in a form that is remarkably consistent. There is a particular category of historical anomaly that is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It does not emerge from a single revelation or a striking contradiction. It emerges from counting, from placing records next to each other and noticing that the numbers do not behave the way the explanation says they should. Not wildly, not shockingly, just consistently across enough cases to make the pattern visible. That is the category this inquiry belongs to. Not a mystery, not an accusation, a pattern. A pattern of civic systems arriving at scales and states of readiness that standard accounts of 19th century urban development have not fully resolved. Not because the accounts are dishonest, but because the questions they were designed to answer were not the questions the timelines eventually began to raise. And the timelines, it turns out, are only the beginning. If the pattern were limited to a handful of American cities in the mid-19th century, it would be an interesting footnote. Civic overreach. Regional ambition. The particular optimism of a young nation building faster than its population could justify. That explanation would hold comfortably, and the conversation would end there. But the pattern does not stay in America. And it does not stay in the mid-19th century. Move the frame to the United Kingdom, specifically to the municipal expansion projects of the 1840s and 1850s, and something similar becomes visible, not identical but structurally consistent in ways that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence and equally difficult to explain through parallel ambition alone. The city of Manchester, by the 1840s, was already one of the most densely populated industrial centers in the world. Its infrastructure problems were severe and well documented. Sanitation failures, overcrowding, contaminated water. These were not abstract policy concerns, they were daily catastrophes. The civic response, when it came, might reasonably be expected to match the scale of the immediate crisis. Repair, patch, extend. Instead, what was constructed between 1847 and 1858 was a water supply network, the Longdendale chain, that drew from reservoirs in the Pennine Hills and delivered clean water through a pipe infrastructure whose total design capacity was calculated, at the time of construction, for a population significantly larger than Manchester then contained. Engineers involved in the project noted in their correspondence that the system was dimensioned not for current need but for a future the city had not yet reached. Standard historical interpretation describes this as responsible long-term planning. Visionary engineering for a city that everyone expected to keep growing. That is a fair reading. But hold it next to what was happening in cities that did not receive comparable investment. Liverpool's water infrastructure through the same period was repeatedly overwhelmed. Birmingham's civic sanitation lagged behind its industrial growth by decades. These were not small or obscure places. They were major centers of British industrial life, and their infrastructure consistently failed to anticipate demand. So the question again is not whether forward planning existed. It clearly did. The question is why it manifested so precisely, so capaciously, in some places and not others, and why, when it did manifest, it tended to arrive at scales calibrated to futures that were still 15, 20, sometimes 40 years away. Move further. Go to continental Europe. The Haussmann renovation of Paris, conducted under Napoleon III between 1853 and 1870, is one of the most studied urban transformations in history. Its scale is staggering. Entire districts demolished and rebuilt, a sewer network constructed beneath the city that remains in its fundamental architecture in operational use today. The Paris sewers, at the time of their construction, were designed to serve a city considerably larger than the Paris of the 1850s. Engineers dimensioned the main collector tunnels for flow volumes that the city would not generate for several decades. Again, planners planned. That is the explanation. But the Paris sewer system also included something that tends to receive less attention in popular accounts. a secondary pressurized water network, running parallel to the sewage system, designed to carry non-potable water for street cleaning, garden irrigation, and fire suppression. This network required a city of significant density and complexity to make operational sense. At the time of its construction, large portions of Paris that the network was designed to serve were still in the process of being built. Infrastructure arrived. The city followed. In Vienna, the Ringstrasse development of the 1860s produced civic buildings, opera houses, parliament buildings, museums, university structures, at a scale and interior complexity that, by any functional accounting, exceeded what the Vienna of that decade required. The Kunsthistorisches Museum, completed in 1891 but designed and constructed through the 1870s and 1880s, was built with gallery space, storage infrastructure, and internal circulation systems dimensioned for a collection and a visitor volume that did not exist at the time the building was designed. The collection had to grow into the building. The building did not grow around the collection. This is, in isolation, an interesting architectural decision. The emperor wanted grandeur. The architects delivered scale. That explanation is available and frequently offered. But notice what is accumulating. A water network built for a larger Manchester, a sewer system dimensioned for a larger Paris, a gallery built for a larger Vienna, civic chambers in St. Louis prepared for a larger St. Louis, plumbing in buildings awaiting water systems that had not arrived. Each instance has its own local explanation. Each explanation applied individually is plausible. The accumulation is what resists easy resolution. Because what emerges when you lay these cases alongside each other is not a list of isolated planning decisions. It is a consistency, a repeated structural condition in which civic infrastructure, across a specific and geographically distributed cluster of cities, appears to have been sized not for the present but for a future that was, in many cases, assumed with unusual confidence. There is another layer to this that historians of urban development occasionally note and then move past: the technical knowledge embedded in some of this infrastructure. The Longdendale water system required precise hydraulic calculations, gradient management, pressure modeling, reservoir capacity ratios, that represented the outer edge of engineering knowledge in the 1840s. The Paris sewer network required survey precision and geological mapping of a complexity that strained the technical resources of the period. The construction timelines, in several cases, were achieved at speeds that contemporaries found remarkable. One engineer involved in the Manchester project wrote, in correspondence now held in archive, that the work proceeded with a fluency that surprised even the project's supervisors, as if, in his words, the ground had been understood before the surveys began. That line, sitting alone in a letter, would mean very little. In the context of the pattern being assembled here, it invites a different kind of attention. Some contemporary researchers, examining these timelines and infrastructure scales collectively, have begun grouping them under a broader interpretive label, a way of naming the pattern without yet resolving it, of marking the consistency without claiming to explain it. That label and what it does and does not mean is where this inquiry leads next. The word appears in online forums first, then in documentary essays, then, gradually, in the margins of more serious architectural and historical discussion, not endorsed, not dismissed, but present in a way that is increasingly difficult to ignore. The word is Tartaria. And before examining what it does or does not mean, it is worth being precise about what it actually is. Tartaria, in its historical usage, refers to a geographic designation found in European maps from roughly the 15th through the 18th centuries. On those maps, large portions of Central Asia, Siberia, and parts of Eastern Europe were labeled Tartaria or Tartary, a loose cartographic term used by Western mapmakers to describe territories that were not well understood, not well surveyed, and not well integrated into European political frameworks. It was less a nation and more a placeholder, a label for the unmapped. That is the documented historical meaning. It is not contested. It is not particularly dramatic. But in contemporary alternative history discourse, the term has been repurposed. It has become an interpretive container, a label applied by a loosely connected community of researchers, enthusiasts, and skeptics to the cluster of anomalies that the previous sections of this inquiry have been documenting. The oversized civic buildings, the infrastructure ahead of demand, the water systems calibrated for absent populations, the technical precision arriving before the technical tradition that supposedly produced it had fully matured. Some researchers who use the Tartaria label argue that these patterns reflect the remnants of a prior civilization, one with advanced organizational or technical capacities that was either destroyed or absorbed, and whose physical legacy was subsequently inherited, repurposed, or quietly incorporated into the historical narratives of the nations that followed. In this interpretation, the buildings were not built by the cities that now claim them. They were found or inherited, and the civic infrastructure discovered within them was simply absorbed into the developing urban systems of the 19th century. This interpretation is not supported by mainstream academic historiography. That is worth stating plainly. Professional historians, architectural scholars, and urban engineers working within established research frameworks do not, as a consensus, endorse the idea that 19th century cities were built on the physical foundations of an undocumented prior civilization. The documentary and archaeological record, as currently interpreted, does not require that conclusion. But a second group of researchers uses the Tartaria label differently, not as a claim about a lost civilization, but as a shorthand for the pattern itself. For them, Tartaria is not an answer. It is a question formatted as a name, a way of pointing at the accumulation of anomalies and saying, these things belong together and we do not yet have a framework adequate to contain them. In this usage, the label is analytical rather than historical. It marks a research problem, not a historical fact. And a third interpretive position, held by some architectural historians and urban scholars who engage with these questions cautiously, suggests something different again. This position holds that the anomalies are real, the scale mismatches, the infrastructure arriving ahead of demand, the technical sophistication appearing earlier than standard developmental timelines predict, but that the explanation lies not in hidden civilizations or erased histories, but in the incomplete nature of the historical record itself. Documentation of 19th century construction is uneven. Funding sources for major civic projects are not always traceable. Engineering knowledge in this period traveled through informal networks, apprenticeships, correspondence, trade and technical manuals, in ways that formal academic histories have not fully mapped. In this reading, the pattern exists. The explanation, however, is not concealment. It is incompleteness. The archive has gaps, and the gaps create the appearance of anomaly where the reality may be simply, we have not found the full record yet. Each of these three interpretive positions is worth holding simultaneously, because none of them is obviously wrong, and none of them is sufficient on its own. The first, the lost civilization reading, asks us to accept a historical claim for which physical and documentary evidence remains at present indirect and contested. The second, the pattern naming reading, is intellectually honest but ultimately circular. It identifies the question and labels it without moving toward resolution. The third, the incomplete archive reading, is methodologically sound but risks becoming a catch-all explanation that absorbs any anomaly without ever being falsifiable. What none of these positions fully resolves is the consistency, not the scale of any individual building, not the ambition of any single civic project. The consistency, the degree to which the pattern repeats across geographies, across national contexts, across decades, in a form that does not vary the way independent local decisions might be expected to vary. Independent decisions produce variation. Local ambitions diverge. Engineering traditions develop at different paces in different places, responding to different pressures, producing different outcomes. That is the expected behavior of organic urban development. What the record shows, in the cluster of cases this inquiry has examined, is something that behaves less like variation and more like a template. The same proportional relationship between design capacity and actual demand. The same sequencing of underground infrastructure before surface development. The same interior scale in civic buildings relative to the populations they were nominally serving. Across Manchester and Paris and Vienna and St. Louis and Cincinnati. Across water systems and sewer networks and public chambers and institutional galleries. A template implies, at minimum, a shared source. What that source was, a shared intellectual tradition, a network of technical exchange more coordinated than historians have yet mapped, an inheritance from prior conditions that the standard record has not adequately captured, or something that does not yet have an adequate name, is a question the existing frameworks have not closed. The Tartaria label, whatever its problems and its misuses, has done one thing with some effectiveness. It has made the pattern visible to a large audience that academic historiography had not reached. The questions that circulate under that label are, in many cases, genuine questions. The answers proposed are frequently inadequate. But the adequacy of an answer is a separate matter from the legitimacy of the question. And the question, why was so much of the civic infrastructure of the 19th century built at scales and states of readiness that the populations of the time did not yet require, remains, in the formal historical literature, less resolved than the confidence of standard accounts tends to suggest. The buildings are still standing. The pipe networks are still, in some cases, in use. The archive is still incomplete. And the dates have not changed.